I'm going to speak today about election cybersecurity with regard to political parties. I work on election law and constitutional law on a day-to-day basis. I'm really hoping we can do a little group therapy here and someone can reassure me. But the two things that keep me up at night, like most parents, probably my kids, that's number one for sure. But the next thing is the 2019 federal election, which is happening less than a year from now. And so we, I think now are at a stage in terms of election cybersecurity where we know about a lot of the threats, but the technology is evolving very quickly and the practices of political parties and political actors is evolving very quickly. So threat environment is a term I'm learning from my colleagues in national security. The threat environment, I think, has gotten scarier and expanded in the last number of years. So take a step back before we dive into political parties. When I was about 15 years old, I volunteered on my first political campaign. So I looked exactly the same, no suit, more hair, but otherwise the same. And the first thing they did for volunteers coming in who were in that age group, maybe they didn't have a lot of other skills to offer, was to say, you have to sleep over in the constituency office tonight because we're worried someone is going to break into the office and steal our voters list. Okay? And so this was a very common thing to have someone on your campaign do because people expected that kind of dirty trick to happen. Okay? From one of the other campaigns, from another kind of actor. That is one kind of threat to electoral integrity or security. It's evolved quite a bit since then, but by background, campaigns and political parties have always been targets for malicious interference by those who would do ill to them. Could be other campaigns, could be foreign actors, could be domestic actors, a variety of different kinds. So this is an old problem, is the bottom line, that's coming up in a new form, and we need to develop new ways of approaching it. So what is election cybersecurity? So I would identify that as protection of the relevant actors and institutions in the electoral process from digital interference. Okay? And those actors and institutions include electoral management bodies, as Holly said, candidates, leadership contestants, and what you would know as interest groups, which the Canada Elections Act calls third parties. Okay? Political parties being the other major entity. So why should we be worried about election cybersecurity with regard to political parties? We have a bunch of very credible and persuasive reports from national security agencies and from Parliament. So a recent report from the Senate of Canada identified interference by both foreign and domestic actors in the 2019 election as a serious issue. There's the excellent CSE report, which will be familiar to many of you, which identifies this as a global phenomenon affecting democracies of all different kinds. And I think occasionally in Canada, we are guilty of patting ourselves in the back and feeling we're a little different and maybe immune from some of these international trends. I think the CSE report is very sobering reading in that regard. Canada has adopted sanctions against individuals involved in foreign governments or malicious activity abroad, sometimes like Magnitsky Act type sanctions, right, which could potentially make Canada a target. So I think there's a lot of reasons to look at the Canadian electoral process and Canadian political parties in particular as potential targets. And the CSE report identifies political parties as one of the weakest links in the whole chain. And I'll go into a little bit more why that is. We also obviously have the example from the United States where the Democratic National Committee's election, or where emails, excuse me, were hacked. Hard to say as a causal matter. I'll defer to Holly, the political scientist, on that, whether it changed the result of the election. But certainly we can surmise that it had some kind of an impact. The Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal, right, on voter privacy, which my colleague Professor Judge will talk about more, also shows how much data there is in the hands of groups, including political parties, that is potentially vulnerable. So a few things we know about the threats. Foreign and domestic actors, so it's not just Russia and China, but it's domestic groups that may have an interest in undermining a particular political party or the electoral process itself, in addition to governments or their clients who are not supportive of elections and democracy. Social media platforms have also dramatically increased the complexity. So Facebook, Twitter, maybe you want to say Instagram as well. They're essentially open networks. The companies that run them have incentives to have larger numbers of users. They don't verify necessarily who is coming on the networks, with the exception of the Twitter blue check mark. And then Facebook periodically kicks fake groups off, or individuals they think are impersonating off periodically. But the openness of social media networks has dramatically increased incidences for foreign actors to intervene in domestic elections, where it's Canadians and Canadian voters who are supposed to have the final say. So that's a little bit about the threat environment. Why should we care in particular about political parties? They've been identified as a weak link, but they play a very particular role in the political system. So they are private entities, technically, under the law. And there's been a long debate in the legal literature about that. So they're heavily regulated. I don't know how many of you had the chance to read the Canada Elections Act. It goes in great, if you have trouble sleeping at night, I highly recommend Part 5. It goes into great detail regulating political parties and almost all things that they do. But parties remain private entities. And even the ability of courts to intervene to ensure, say, fair internal processes is sometimes in doubt. There's a recent case from the Supreme Court of Canada called Wall on judicial review of the actions of private bodies that might have a public function. And I think that indicates we're going to see even less judicial oversight of what happens internally to parties. But parties are private entities. They don't have the same access to the resources of, say, the federal government or provincial governments. They have their own internal processes. They all differ from one another. Some of them are very large and sophisticated, right? You can think of the Liberal Party, Conservative Party, the NDP. Others are small and new and have very few resources to dedicate at all. So the Belfer Center at the Kennedy School, many people are likely familiar with. They do tabletop exercises for US electoral management bodies. They also do a lot of work with political parties, and they put out reports which mainly consist of saying, pay attention to a cybersecurity. You can get hacked. Use two-factor authentication, have separate special devices for people who work on campaigns. Pretty basic stuff, but what that indicates is political parties, even very well-funded ones in the US, are not following kind of basic cybersecurity protocols, which again goes to making them extra vulnerable. And I just want to say one thing about trust, because Holly brought it up. Imagine what would happen if one of Canada's 3 major political parties was hacked and all their internal emails were disclosed, or the large amounts of data they hold about individual Canadians, which Professor Judge will talk about more, was released, right? So how confident would you then feel answering a telephone call from a political party, or answering the door and giving them information about your voting intentions, right? Or donating money to, these are all things political parties need in order to help them win votes, right, and win elections and compete, but also that we need collectively to have democracy function given the special role of political parties. All that is in doubt if individuals lose trust in the operations of parties, which is a live risk and potential consequence of digital interference. So the real question, because political parties are private entities, right, is how to actually incentivize them to take cybersecurity seriously. So the Belfer Center's reports try to shame them a little bit and say these are the best practices, and you can do them at relatively low cost, but the stakes are quite high for some of those reasons I mentioned. They're volunteer based. They are private. Cybersecurity best practices cost some money, I think. Political parties are not traditionally used to spending money in those areas. There used to be a subsidy directly, per vote subsidy directly to parties. Now parties, that's no longer in place. That's a whole other complicated policy discussion about whether that's a good or a bad thing. But parties now rely on private donations. They have a lot of pressure on them to spend their money and resources wisely. I think it's reasonable to assume they're not spending enormous amounts on election cybersecurity right now. Obviously, they guard their private operations quite closely, right? Hard as outside researchers to know exactly what's happening, but I think that's a reasonable assumption. We also, I think, can reasonably assume that they're not currently following best practices. So all the parties have privacy policies, as my colleagues will, as Professor Judge will mention. Reading through their privacy policies is not very inspiring for the level of sophistication with which protecting data is happening right now. You think it would be reflected some more in their public statements about what they do. So what kind of threats in particular, digital interference is possible? Hacking, that's the DNC example. Canada does not have e-voting, as Holly mentioned, except at municipalities, but political parties often do have online voting in their leadership selection processes, and sometimes even in their candidate selection processes. And there's been several instances, the NDP had one of these, where there were dedicated denial of service attacks and phishing attacks and things that actually slowed down tabulation and announcing of the results of leadership races, okay, which did not inspire trust, I don't think, in their members or in the general public. Another possible form of digital interference, in addition to hacking and denial of service, is impersonation. Okay? And so Twitter's got the blue check mark to say this is really the Minister of the Environment and not somebody else. The thing that I think is the most worrisome right now in terms of impersonation is deep fakes. Okay? And so one of the discussions about fake news, kind of a related topic, right? How can you tell if a news story, especially that you're reading on Facebook, is accurate or not? Okay? Did it really come from the New York Times? Or if it came from some other source, is the content true? How do you evaluate that? And there's varying reports on Canadians and capacity to determine whether something is true or not that they read, that a friend recommends on Facebook, right, or likes on Facebook, okay? But imagine the scenario when you have very sophisticated technology, which now doesn't cost very much, where you can create fake videos that are very hard even for the people in this room, right, who are sophisticated on cybersecurity and sophisticated users of the online world, to tell the difference, right? So a video of the Prime Minister announcing we are going to war with country X, right? A video of a candidate doing something illegal, right? And so the example I always like to use, even though it's not really a pleasant one to discuss, but Hillary Clinton was accused in the last US presidential election of being engaged in a pedophile ring operating out of a pizza parlor, right, in Washington, D.C. I don't know if people were aware of this. Easily refuted. The pizza activities were supposed to have happened in the basement. The pizza parlor had no basement, right? So people believed these for a variety of different reasons, or disbelieved them for a variety of different reasons. But imagine if you had a fake video of candidate Clinton going down some basement stairs into it, right? So you could imagine it would be even harder for sophisticated consumers of news to determine what was real or what was fake in that scenario. And the 2019 election is going to see a lot more of these deep fakes, just in a way that was not the case in 2015, has not been the case in any election in the past. So hacking, denial of service, and impersonation, especially through deep fakes, are all very relevant for political parties. So legal reforms. I'm a lawyer and a legal academic. C-76, the Election Modernization Act, is before the House of Commons, before the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs right now. It's an extremely lengthy bill. It's 300 and something pages. I believe the committee's considered several hundred amendments. Maybe some people in the room wrote some of them. C-76 does take some steps to addressing cybersecurity generally. Okay, I think not enough in particular regard to political parties, but it does take some positive steps with regard to cybersecurity generally. So there's a new offense on interfering with the computer. Okay, now we can question how the enforcement will work if what we're really talking about is a troll factory, right, in Eastern Europe somewhere or in Russia somewhere, right? So how the law applies extraterritorially is always an issue, but an offense of interfering with the computer, particularly that could be useful with regard to domestic hackers, that's one important change. Impersonating a politician will be an offense. Okay, and there's some narrow ways it's narrowed legally, but that is an important advancement, and I read the provision to apply to deep fakes. We'll see if the courts agree or the law enforcement agencies, but I think it's broad enough to apply to that kind of impersonation. And there's a whole host of new restrictions on foreign interference. Okay, so it used to be if you're a foreign entity and you spent under, the law still has not been passed, so, but if it's passed, today, if you spend under $500 and you're a foreign entity, not actually illegal. Most of the rules on campaign finance apply only during the official campaign period, right? Usually 37 days or so up until election day. Last one was longer, 70-something days. So these would apply. The bill would apply bans on foreign interference continuously, not just during the campaign period, and regardless of how much money was spent, and would bring in some technical means to be able to oversee what third-party interest groups are doing, having to have separate bank accounts and things like that, so you can trace foreign money coming in and out. And there's some technical details why I think that's a good thing, and Elections Canada has recommended it. It doesn't do anything on fake news, right? Which you could kind of, because there's constitutional issues there that are more complicated. My fake news might not be your fake news, and everybody has freedom of political expression. So I'm not going to go into that in detail, but that's one factor. It does go some way in regulating social media platforms. So the Elections Act regulates parties, candidates, leadership contestants, third parties. And when something new comes up, the number of groups or the types of groups that are regulated expand. So we had the robocall scandal, so now telephone voter contact companies are regulated. Okay, they were not before that. C-76 would bring social media platforms under the rubric as well. They couldn't knowingly take money from a foreign entity that was placing an ad on their site. That's one important change, and it's not in the current version of the bill unless amendments have happened as we speak, but I believe one of the amendments that's likely to have support at the committee is to require entities like Facebook to keep a repository of all political ads that happen on their site. Facebook does some of that voluntarily now. In my view, that as a voluntary measure is not adequate. They could change it at any time. Not clear if they actually follow the definitions for political advertising under the Elections Act. So having it mandated in the bill, which I believe is going to happen, would be a good thing. The bill also does require that parties have privacy policies, which affects how they treat data, which Professor Judge will go into. It doesn't address the need for a protocol among the relevant political actors, including political parties, Elections Canada, national security agencies, of the type there is in the US for what the public should know and what the steps are if there's, say, digital interference in the middle of an election campaign, right? Puts all of you good folks in the government in a tough position if you have to decide whether to disclose hacking by a foreign entity that targeted only one of the political parties and not others. We saw that in the US, so it doesn't address that. And it doesn't provide additional funding in particular. We saw the Commissioner of Elections Canada, the enforcement wing was just in the news yesterday or today, hiring 3 people to look at social media and foreign interference in the lead up to the next election for enforcement. I'm not sure if that's sufficient in their view or not. Maybe that's the funding that they have, but C-76 does not really address the funding issue in detail. So it deals with cybersecurity generally, but not in a way that I would say directly incentivizes political parties to up their game in a way that's necessary to address the current threat environment, in my view. Okay. So what are the options? Political parties are private entities, they're heavily regulated, but it seems too heavy-handed to pass a law saying you must address election cybersecurity, right? What would that mean? There's different views on the content. So the approach that I favor, and I'd like to advocate to all of you, is incentives built into the political financing system. Okay? So political parties currently indirectly receive public funding. One way is through the tax rebate that you get as an individual if you donate to parties. That effectively indirectly subsidizes parties. But they also get direct subsidies back for the expenses of the candidates and parties during the election campaign. Okay? And the idea is that for a healthy democracy, we need parties funded at a certain level, not just the largest ones, to be able to compete. And if they spend money, they can communicate with voters, they can get their message out, they can get their voters out, and that we, as a collective, as the public, should somehow fund that. So you don't get 100% of your election campaign expenses refunded, because then you'd have you'd have an incentive to spend as much as possible all the time, right? But one way to address cybersecurity would be to have a similar kind of refund or rebate for a percentage of a political party's spend on election cybersecurity. The assumption behind this approach is they are private entities, we can't be too heavy-handed in regulating them, and that cost is a very significant barrier, which is my best understanding right now in 2018 why parties aren't doing this. They're starting to get the issue, right, for all the reasons that I've said, the big news items, but the cost is still prohibitive, especially for the medium to small size parties. So having access to public funding for election cybersecurity expenses is one way around that. We'd have to come up with a way of defining what is cybersecurity so they're not spending it on other things. We would have to come up with an oversight mechanism. I think we have a good one already in Elections Canada, which already oversees political financing and looks at receipts and figures out if spending was really happening in a legitimate way or not. But I think that is a positive way forward where we can incentivize spending on election cybersecurity, respecting the legal status of political parties, and also being responsible with public finance. You'd have to set a percentage amount that could be refunded. You'd maybe have to set a total amount they could get back. But I think it's a positive way forward and one that I would love to see adopted. So I look forward to a conversation, and this is a very great interdisciplinary group. I learned a lot from this morning, and look forward to all of your questions in the Q&A. Happy to take them in English ou en français. Merci.